Okay, so we're going to start this class off looking at some orienting concepts, some major theories in child development, and then we'll zone in on lifespan developments and theories there that apply for the whole of development, but are kind of unique to looking at lifespan from birth to death. In this next video, because I'm trying to keep these short so that they're manageable for you guys to watch, we're just going to hit the major theories and central questions. Then we'll come back with a third video for this week for lifespan development. Okay. So some basics about developmental science. We're always trying to kind of negotiate a tension between focusing on what's changing and what's shaping the individual and the group, the social group they're a part of. Again, this focus on context, right? People are not developing in isolation. If you want to understand how a child or an adult is developing, you have to understand the social groups, the cultural context, the political spheres, the historical moment in which that person is developing, right? So there's always kind of a tension because we're focused on the development of the individual, but that doesn't make any sense without looking at the broader picture, right? So it's kind of both always. There's also applied or action research and basic research. We're going to look at a little bit of both. Both clinical work as well as IO sometimes tend more towards the applied or action, right? Because we're dealing with real problems and kind of dealing with what is the answer to this actual thing going on in the world, as opposed to which sounds do babies learn first, right? So there's a difference between the basic trying to figure out in general, but also the applied action. So I also want to remind you just a little bit, because it's important when thinking about different areas of psych in particular, to kind of go back to what you know about methods, right? So we're wanting to be as objective as possible in all of these studies. This is a big focus for the connection papers assignments that you have. Don't tell me what you think the kid did. Don't say, well, you could tell he was mad. How could you tell he was mad? Right? So be as objective as possible. Some of the things that are clear indicators to you of one thing might be evidence of something else for someone else. We also want to look at whether our ratings of behavior, our responses to prompts are reliable. Things may change over time. Is that a problem? Is that okay? Depends on what kinds of questions we're asking and what we think that evidence means. We have a replicability crisis in psych in general. Not a lot of people are able to reproduce the exact findings of other studies. This is in developmental science as well. And so it's partially a problem to look at how replicable some of these findings might be. And also for each of these studies to look at what is valid, right? And this really comes into play when we're talking about culture in the context of development, because what is a milestone for development in a white, middle class, English speaking family that I came from may not be a milestone for development that is important for another cultural context. So another thing to keep in mind as we're going into this, correlation is not causation. Here are two things, each of these bullet points, that are correlated, but they are not, the finding out the causes of each of these things is much more complicated, right? So poverty is correlated with being overweight. If you are below the poverty line, you are more likely to be overweight. On the other hand, poverty does not cause being overweight. It may relate to access to healthy foods. It may relate to access to healthy and safe places to exercise, right? It doesn't make you overweight. It correlates, right? There's also IQ is correlated with voting patterns. The one I have here is the 2004 presidential elections. That was ages ago, but IQ continues to be correlated with voting patterns, in that IQ is correlated with education, and having especially liberal arts education, where you are exposed to other viewpoints other than those that you may have grown up with, is also correlated with um, voting more liberally. Okay, so there's multiple of these big theories, and the slides themselves, without me talking over them, that are also posted. I give an example of each of these in depth. I'm not going to do that here, but I wanted to give you some ideas of kind of the different ways we explain change in child development. So one of those is looking at biological maturation. So this is very much focused on physical and biological change. Um, uh, what is the kid able to do? What are their behaviors showing us? What is an adult doing? What are their behaviors showing us? Tracing all of this back to biological maturation of the physical body, right? And the brain. So the environmental learning perspective, this is going back to operant conditioning. This is going back to classical conditioning. The idea here is that focusing on all behavior being learned, right? What is the environment providing for us that is teaching us or helping us to acquire different abilities, different skills? How is the environment leading us to learn and to develop that way? Then the constructivist perspective, this is where our buddy Piaget comes in. We're going to talk about Piaget a ton in this class. So Piaget, one of the main theorists in child development, looked at kids as, he called them little scientists, and he argued that they were trying to figure the world out based on the biological and maturation of their physical and their brain, their physical body and their brain, as well as this learning and these conditioned responses that they're getting from the environment. So between all of this info from their body growing and maturing and from the environment, they're kind of constructing, constructivist, and this is the term, right? They're constructing their understanding of the world, right? And then the last one here is the cultural context perspective. And this one is closest to what I have been trained in. And this is the idea that is kind of a slight change on the constructivist perspective, but looking at biological maturation and some universal aspects of the environment. We can argue that in most healthy environments, kids do have a caregiver. Who that caregiver is may vary tremendously, but they have a caregiver, so they have an attachment of some sort to a caregiver, right? We could say that might be a universal in healthy environments. And then the culture is almost the lens through which kids are interpreting and working with this biology, but also these universal aspects of the environment to build their understanding of the world. So this last one is similar to the constructivists in that kids are constructing their understanding of the world, but also shows the role of culture in kind of mediating where that where those ideas about the world are coming from, right? Okay, so I also wanted to give you a quote from Goff. This is nice here. That we don't know what we see what we know. This is really particularly important in thinking about that cultural context perspective, right? We assume that their children's environments are as ours were. We can assume that other adults' environments are as ours were. Many of you may have examples in your life, in your maybe in your practicum, where you've been able to say, whoa, yeah, those are not the assumptions that I had going into this about what a 4-year-old does, right? That is not the understanding I had going into this about what 25 looks like, right? So changes in our understandings um, help us to kind of put these ideas of this is what development looks like, right, into a better um, into a better and clearer vision, right? Rather than saying this is what it looks like in my family, in my community, and therefore that is what these milestones, these ages and stages look like for everybody. Okay. I also wanted to bring up the concept of deficits. So this is related to that suggestion to suspend judgment because we do not know what we see what we know, right? We are biased to being able to see the stuff that we're familiar with. We're also biased in missing stuff that we're not familiar with. So we may tend to see things missing in other groups and other cultural groups um, rather than seeing what they're doing that might be different and meeting the same kinds of goals or needs. So categories, stereotypes are cognitive tools. It is not a problem to say, well, it seems like most folks from this area tend to eat these plants that are growing in this area, right? That is not a problem. So long as you are open to adjusting those assumptions when new evidence comes in, right? And so long as we're not attaching values um, uh, to those assumptions without being able to edit them and correct them. Okay, so next deal, let's talk about central questions. This is again getting back at some of those major kind of theoretical pushes, some of the major concepts that we study in child development. And we'll talk about each of these four in turn. So continuity is the idea of whether we are growing gradually and continuously across life, like a starfish, or growing in abrupt stage-like discontinuities, like some sort of fly, right? That might be living in a very different place, looking very different, moving around the world very differently in different stages of their life. The issue with this is that the answer is yeah, both, right? When we're talking about children, because development is gradual in some areas and continuous in others. So we need to look at both of these kinds of ways of developing across the lifespan. But it's a good question to ask about behaviors that you're seeing, about stages that have been proposed. Is that really a stage? Is there really a lot of things happening at once that are changing in kind, not just more or less? What's really going on here? Okay, so some characteristics of developmental stages. You've probably heard of developmental stages before, but some kind of, these are the key aspects that make something a developmental stage. Qualitative changes. For babies, an easy one is crawling to walking. A lot changes around the same time that kids are moving from crawling to walking. We often get our first words around that same time. Connection to and relationship with parents is different. Our ability to point to or indicate objects, ask for objects, or talk about objects, indicate objects is greater because we're not using our hands to move around as much. So there's lots of things going on at the same time, and it's a qualitative change. It's not just more movement or less movement. It is that, but it's also a different kind of movement, right? And as I already said, a lot of things are changing all at the same time. If we talk about this in the context of lifespan development, this change from mostly crawling to mostly walking is pretty quick. So qualitative changes, simultaneous changes in lots of different aspects of behavior, rapid changes, and the simultaneous changes that are all coming together have some coherent pattern to them, right? Walking comes with pointing, following gaze, because you're more upright, so you're more able to see somebody's gaze. You're using language more. That's also with better being able to point at things, interact with things with an adult. So there's a lot of these things that are coming together. That's what we need in order to call it a stage. Okay, so the next central question is nature versus nurture. And this is a funny thing because we often talk about nature versus nurture. I'm sure you've heard this before, right? Um, and I would argue that the nature versus nurture or nature or nurture is a silly question because it's always both. Um, these are inseparable aspects of development. Two examples to give you of why these are inseparable. I'm actually going to go with the Effie example first, even though that's second on the page. But there are lots of things that we have long suspected were most kids that we had studied had done all of these things at the same time. So we figured that this was about nature, right? Doesn't matter what parents do, kids are always going to have their first words at about 1 year olds, right? Doesn't matter what parents do, kids are always going to sit up on their own at about 6 to 9 months, right? Whatever the milestone is. Um, and for a lot of infancy, development in infancy, we had believed that a lot of that was more influenced by nature because the babies haven't been out of the womb that long, right? Not a lot of time for nurture to impact them. Well, we know better now. But an example would be a counterexample is the FA children. FA babies walk on average about 3 months earlier than US babies. And 3 months, if we're talking about that age, right, 9 months versus a year on average, is huge, huge, especially given on that last slide when I talked about all of those other things that tend to come with walking, right? All these other changes that kind of change at the same time, right? Um, and the question was, okay, so what's going on here? We don't have experimental studies that have controlled everything to be able to say for certain what our causes are in this scenario, but there are extensive ethnographies of the FA people who live in the Congo, Democratic Congo, and they uh, treat their babies really different. So from very early on, they don't work to support a child's neck when they're holding it, right? Really, really big thing. One of the first things you'll get told if you're gonna hold a baby here in the US is support his head, right? Not a thing that they would do there. So they have babies who are hanging out on mom's shoulder or on a mom's hip with their head hanging to the side. Well, that's uncomfortable. So the babies get stronger neck muscles earlier. They get better at practicing and managing their own balance earlier. They also have a practice where they have babies, they dig a little hole in the dirt and sit babies in the hole. So babies have a supported way of sitting up on their own, right? Earlier on. So babies are being able to handle their neck muscles, being more upright, handling their own balance of their head earlier. And this may or may not, again, we don't have conclusive kinds of scientific studies that would tell us that this is caused, but this seems to relate to this difference in who walks first. So while we had once thought that this timing of walking was completely nature, turns out it's also nurture. The other example I wanted to give you is the cesarean section. So back in the day, um, the cesarean section was invented to allow babies, initially babies with bigger heads, to be born. If you were a mom before cesarean sections were possible, and you had a baby with a really big um, diameter of skull, right? It was likely to get stuck in the birth canal and not be able to be born, killing both the baby and the mom, right? No more baby, no more mom, no more genes that would predict having a larger head, right? So we have been doing cesarean sections more and more. The percentage of cesarean sections varies across um, countries in the world, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. But we've been doing more cesarean sections and interceding in these pregnancies where moms and babies would have died because of the size of the infant's head. As a result, moms are living, babies are living, babies are going on to make more babies that have these genes for larger heads. As a result, as long as we've been keeping track, the diameter of the human head has been increasing. So there are more big heads out there because the babies who survived because of the cesarean section have been able to reproduce. So the question here is, where's nature and nurture in this example, right? Um, Really hard pressed to say that a cesarean section, cutting a mom open and removing a child from her abdomen um, through surgery, is nature, right? That is, I've got to say, a cultural intervention. That is nurture. Um, Yet, that intervention has changed the gene pool, right? One of many things that we have done culturally, historically, that have changed the gene pool. So nature has changed nurture. Again, these are always working together. Okay. Um, and as I said before, this nature nurture question really kind of comes back to biology versus environment and thinking about the mix of, or the contributions of each to particular developmental milestones or behaviors. Okay, next central question is plasticity. And the question here is, to what degree and under what conditions is development open to change or intervention? How much can we change it? Is it possible to take an infant at this age of the kid on the picture and say, this kid is for sure going to graduate college? Can we know that at that age? Are there contextual cues that we could use to determine that kid's going to college? Right? That's the question, right? That is plasticity. How much are things open to change? So when we're talking about plasticity, we get into the issue of critical and sensitive periods. So critical periods are the notion that if it does not happen at this developmental point in time, at this stage, at this age, it will not happen, right? Critical is, if it doesn't happen now, it's not happening, period, right? Um, Funny dude in the picture with geese um, was kind of testing this critical period for these geese, in that whatever these geese see first after they hatch, they consider mom and bond to that thing that animal that they see. So he arranged that he would be the first thing that these geese saw when they hatched, and here he is showing them how to swim. So yeah, that was a cute story about the geese, but what about humans? For humans, there's not a whole lot that is critical periods. We have a lot of this other type of thing I mentioned before, talking about sensitive periods. Critical periods, the one that I haven't had a ton of pushback on that I have argued for is sex determination. If we're talking about sex in terms of X's and Y chromosomes, um, that is kind of set in stone once a sperm enters an egg. There's a chemical signal released to not let other sperm in, and the genetic makeup um, from there is somewhat um, determined. There's a lot that can happen after that, right? But whether that sperm is an X or a Y is going to determine whether the infant that is developing from that insemination is XX or XY. We have sensitive periods, however, about language acquisition um, and emotional bonding or attachment. And you guys may have studied these in other classes, but the idea here is that it's not the case that if it doesn't happen at this point, it's not happening, right? That's critical. For a sensitive period, it's if it doesn't happen at this point, it's a ton harder, right? It's harder. So if you don't have any language by 7 or 8, it is much harder to learn any language. If you don't have any emotional bonding, any attachment to anybody beyond 3, after age 3, it is really hard to establish those kinds of trusting, kind of interdependent relationships. Um, so it's not that it's impossible, it's just that it's much harder, right? And all of this is related to studies of resilience, because if we were to know that that attachment is going to be harder after a certain point, we might dedicate more resources to it. If we thought it was impossible, that would change how we would deal with a child that didn't have a healthy attachment in their life, right? Okay, and then the last one here is central question here is individual differences. And this is where we talk about how do individuals become different from the others around them. We've used this to try to understand amazing folks, but also really horrible folks, right? What's up with Mozart's musical ability? How did he develop that, right? But also, what happened to create a personality like Hitler's? How do we avoid making that happen again, right? Um, and this individual differences often talks about personality. It also may talk about main life events and reactions to trauma or to opportunities. And this may also look at pathologies. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here. These kind of general ideas for how we approach thinking about questions about um, child development, some intro into theories of child development.